All right, well, we'll get started. As always, Dr. Beh, it's just such an honor to have you here.
Pleasure.
I
Thank
know
you so much.
you're super busy, not just seeing patients. We're going to let you talk a little bit about opening your practice later on in today's. So I know there's being a private practice owner, that's unexplainable, all the work
Indeed.
that has to be done. And I will keep the intro a little short because some of the questions I want to ask you in the beginning part of this, which is learning a little bit more about you and letting you kind of expand in your own words. But for those of you who may not know Dr. Beh, seeing so many familiar names, I know you do because you follow his work just like I do. He is founder and director of the Beh Center for Vestibular and Migraine. He's a neurologist, a diplomat of the American Board of Neurology and Psychiatry. You've helped countless patients. Many of our patients at our clinic in Austin, so thank you for that. Considered a real thought leader in the vestibular space for healthcare providers. And we're just again fortunate to have you here. And you spoke for the Vestibular Disorders Association, for Vestibular Today. Again, it's like you have a road show. You have your own road show. And today we'll talk a little bit about your book, Vestibular Migraines. So you're a neurologist, but even before med school, like what inspired you to become a medical doctor?
It was mainly interest. So, I always had this, interest in the natural sciences, biology, chemistry. I sucked at physics. I never liked physics. Math and physics were not my thing. Never liked them. So, but I found chemistry, biology to be more interesting. So, I was like, oh, out of interest, medicine I thought would be a good area to go into. So, no dramatic stories about, why I went into medicine, but, just mainly interest. So I went into med school. It took me the longest time to figure out what specialty I wanted to go into. But eventually, I found, neurology was quite an interesting area. Very, unusual, disease conditions, very interesting way of reasoning things out. And then, from neurology, then narrowed down, the eye movement stuff, the vestibular system was, super fascinating.
And you had just such a unique opportunity to train with world, thought leaders in this space. Dr. Z, I met you here when you were a guest lecturer at UT at the Health Science Center, which was I was blown away by your lecture. And I mean, you have to think of how much you've accomplished just in 15 years. I just want to share, like, not only are you a neurologist, you completed fellowships in neuroimmunology, neurotology, neuro-ophthalmology, did a lot around multiple sclerosis. You published, educator, you wrote a great book that we'll talk about, on vestibular migraines. And so for you, how important, obviously it's important to you just to like dive in deep. What's your opinion on kind of the importance of lifelong learning for healthcare providers?
It's super important. I always, I think I call myself a PGY 11 now. so, yeah, so, we keep learning. It's non-stop learning. It's, we have to, I think part of it is, knowing that, we don't know everything. When I first started off in, looking at vestibular disorders, my interest was like, oh my God, it's so, such an elegant little area. If it's downbeat nystagmus, you say, oh, it's the cerebellum. If you see the gaze-evoked nystagmus, it's this. Upbeat nystagmus is the medulla. Beautiful. It's as simple as that. But then, you learn, oh my goodness, it's really not that simple. You could have, different types of nystagmus from so many different things. There's so many different nuances here and there. Then you learn, these little case reports, from time to time. Like, I mean, one thing I learned recently, cases of refractory BPPV actually get better with migraine management. So,
wow,
like Dr. Riz and Dr. Tishedo,
yeah.
we're talking about that, and I was like, oh, that is fascinating. So it's always there are always things to learn, so many new things to learn all the time. And I think, having that curiosity is, really important, I think that ensures the success for many clinicians, for many healthcare providers. If you have that curiosity, always wanting to try and learn something new, I think that will help you succeed.
Yeah, and I think for me, I had to become really comfortable. I think I saw education as a journey,
Yep.
A and B and C, and then I had to become comfortable with the more you know, or the more you think you know, the more you actually don't know. And so the years of experience, I think if it almost makes the interview process easier, or kind of maybe going through an exam faster, but actually knowing what's going on with each patient remains a mystery. So
Absolutely,
frequent.
and you're right. I've when I was with Dr. Z up at Hopkins, the main thing I would come away every clinic session with him is, oh my goodness, I don't know a lot. Although you learn stuff there, and then you realize I really don't know. There's so many things I don't know, and I think that's the beauty of it. If we realize, knowing, I think to paraphrase what's Rumsfeld, the unknown unknown.
Yep.
And the known unknown, right? So if you are receptive to stuff that you don't know, I think that opens up a lot of areas for us to learn more, right? So like example is with the cephalid device, the external trigeminal stimulation. I was like, at first I had no confidence that it would help people with vertigo and dizziness, but you know what, we'll try it out and see, right? Let's just see what happens, and it seemed to help. So I was like, oh, okay. So it does help. So, another thing to help, our dizzy patients.
Yeah, and I know that's one of the questions sent in that we'll touch base on. Again, I encourage people to watch the interview you did for Vestibular Today, because you did a great explanation on those devices. So I know there'll be a lot of questions around that. So I thought, so this right here, we'll be letting you know if you don't know about this book. Dr. Beh has an interesting story that he shares about why he wrote that for patients versus through publications or specific to healthcare providers. This is priceless. This is an amazing book. So thank you for your efforts. We share it with patients. It's an onboarding for new therapists. So thank you. I'm curious. You wrote this book during COVID, a short amount of time with so much great information. If you could write a new chapter or add to a chapter since you've written this book, do you have any new thoughts around it?
I think one of the areas which I think we need to talk more about is definitely vestibular therapy. Like the role of vestibular therapy in people with vestibular migraine, because it's so nuanced. It's very difficult to capture exactly, you can't make like a single rule that says, everyone with vestibular migraine, this is what you have to do, right? Because everyone is so different. And I think that's where, having an experienced vestibular therapist is so important. You need somebody who can, tailor a program for each patient, because everyone starts off at different level. I do have patients who, they cannot even manage the simplest of, just looking at something and then moving the head around. So, having a good vestibular therapist who can manage that, who can, make a treatment plan to deal with, the so many different scenarios that you can encounter with vestibular migraine, I think is great. So, if I could add something to the book, I would say definitely I want to add more on vestibular therapy. The nuances, different types of exercises. It's hard to recommend a whole set to the patients, but I think having people aware of the importance of vestibular therapy and having a good vestibular therapist working with them is hugely important.
Yeah, and I think that's why it becomes so important to understand the anatomy and physiology and how unique each person is, because the research, even for us, is not out there about the perfect sets, the perfect reps, there's no protocol, because as I've say a million times, once you've seen one patient with dizziness, you've seen one patient with dizziness. And so you do have to customize it. And so I think there's just, some important points, like for us, we really want to look at recovery. We do want to know someone's symptoms, but also move away from logging symptoms all the time and be like, well, how quickly did you recover from that?
Yep.
It is quite challenging, and I know there's some questions that I'll come back to around therapy. So for you, you've transitioned now into private practice. You've been able to work with some amazing world thought leaders in this space. But do you have any kind of personal aha moments, or really those that stand out to you about where you are today, whether it's from your mentors, from your family, from your friends, from your patients, any of those that come to mind?
I think early on, one of the biggest ones was, I realized that when I first started off, I did 50% MS, 50%, dizzy patients. I always thought, you know what, most of my practice is going to be MS. I'm just doing, dizziness, it's a kind of a side thing, right? Little did I know. But over time, I really realized that, the need for a neurologist to see our dizzy patients is huge, much more even compared to our MS population. I mean, the number of patients with vertigo and dizziness, file numbers, the MS patients, and, we already have like a lot of very talented MS doctors around, and so, I thought, hey, let me focus more on the dizzy patients. And, the aha moment came when I was like, a lot of the patients have vestibular migraine. I'm making this diagnosis a lot. And, so decided to focus more on that, really refine, how to treat these patients, learning more about the symptoms. And every time, all the experiences with our, vestibular migraine patients were almost like aha moments. There's so many things, that I learned from them. And another aha moment came at COVID, right? Because, before that, I wrote the little review. Dr. Deb Friedman, she's excellent. Mm-hmm. She's with the Journal on Neuro-Ophthalmology. They commissioned this review on vestibular migraine. And, after writing it, I was like, I realized, there's quite a lot of information out there. And, it's so difficult to cover all of the information with our patients, right? How can you cover everything in one little clinic visit and, have insurance pay for it, right?
Yeah.
It's impossible. So, I decided, to help with patient education, and caregiver education, decided, try to put everything into writing. At first I thought, it's not going to take too long, but another aha moment came out. Like, oh my goodness, there's a lot to put. So,
yeah.
It took longer than I expected. But, eventually added more and more to it. And like, okay, I think it's good for our patients to, something for them to start off with, and, a good place for them to start and learn, about their condition.
Well, and I think the book, it empowers patients to go to their healthcare providers with more information. And so it's really that kind of boots on the ground approach of how long is it going to take to have more use? Well, there's only one you, we know that. And so it's going to take a long time to grow the medical communities to support the need. So by educating patients, then they can go and share the information.
Yep.
It helps a lot of people kind of take out that message. So it's such a great book. Yep. Okay. So there's so much more to learn about you. I'm curious before we move to the Q&A. And again, we had already received some questions, and I'll continue to monitor if there's additional questions. But before we move to the Q&A, do you have, well, you've kind of already given some, advice of stay curious, probably kind of be more afraid of not what you know, but you don't know what you don't know.
Exactly.
And do you have any new advice, whether it's a physician or a therapist that's newer in this space, and or for the more seasoned provider from what you've learned in working with this patient population?
I think the main thing to remember when it comes to actually a lot of conditions with vertigo and dizziness is that, recovery is actually, or improvement actually, is very, very, very possible. We go into it, a lot of the patients, and I see, unfortunately just put on meclizine and, bye. And they go on to suffer for a long time, and, and they think that, there's no hope there's no treatment that's available. But most of the conditions are very, very treatable. If you talk about vestibular migraine, super treatable. And you all are very familiar, BPPV, incredibly treatable. Triple PD, also pretty treatable, right? NDDS, trickier, but also, treatable to quite a large extent. And so a lot of the disorders actually, can be treated. I think the main thing to realize is, not to give up too early. It's not just meclizine and goodbye, or, just vestibular therapy. Every dizzy patient gets shipped off for vestibular therapy, but, even so, and the therapist is, everything is thrown on the therapist to, figure out what's going on and how to help them. And actually, honestly, you guys do most of the work. A lot of the patients I've seen, the diagnosis actually has come from the vestibular therapist. And then they're like, yeah, you probably have, MDDS, or you probably have vestibular migraine, you probably have triple PD, go see so and so. Right. So, most of the conditions are very treatable. So, keeping that in mind, I think it's very, helpful, and it's rewarding because, hey, who doesn't like to see, when your patients get better?
Right. Yeah, exactly. So, we'll go actually, and actually has to do with what you said with one of the questions. This has to do with BPPV. So, it's fairly recognized that there's a higher recurrence of BPPV with vestibular migraine. Do you find with your patients that vestibular migraine often results in more complicated BPPV? And if so, is there a certain kind of pattern in that, or is it all over the place?
So generally with migraine, people tend to have a higher recurrence of BPPV. Why that is not very clear just yet. One of the hypotheses is that, I think in animal models, it showed that, trigeminal inflammation can cause, inner ear damage, right? So that's one possibility there, that, with uncontrolled migraine or repeated migraine attacks, you're actually causing, microscopic damage to the inner ear, and that's increasing the recurrence of BPPV. That's one hypothesis there. With vestibular migraine, that could also be present, right? But I think what makes vestibular migraine a little more complex is that, it can also manifest with positional vertigo. So, when you have vestibular migraine that's presenting with positional vertigo and the patient also has BPPV, I think then that makes it a little more complicated. But then that goes back to, your physical exam and everything. And so, when you do your positional testing, if you see, central nystagmus, okay, you can say it's a, vestibular migraine. If it's, the typical, BPPV type of nystagmus, then you can safely say BPPV and treat it.
All right. And, when you just mentioned the trigeminal nerve, now there was, and I do not know how long the period was, but it was for quite a while thought that migraines were vascular in nature. And then now there's more discussions on the trigeminal nerve. So because of that, do you see, there's been some proposed movement not to use basilar migraines anymore. Do you have any thoughts around that? Are you a supporter of that? Do you still think there's basilar migraines, or is it probably pretty trigeminal in nature?
I think it's the trigeminal one. So the term basilar migraines, I think they've also come away from that. Now it's called, migraine with brainstem aura. Initially they thought that it was, because of the basilar artery was contracting that was causing the issues. But, now we know it's not the case. It's more trigeminal. So, I think basilar migraine, the term is, we don't really use that anymore. It's more migraine with brainstem aura now.
And then, again, in your interview with Vestibular Today, you talked quite a bit about, the devices that you use. I think for our listeners, if you could just briefly talk about the use on the trigeminal versus the vagus nerve, and does that help all migraine? Not all patients, but is it beneficial in both traditional kind of headache migraine and vestibular? Can it stop a migraine? What are your thoughts on that?
So the devices, the two of them, right? There's the gamma core, which is the vagus nerve stimulator, and then there's the cephaly, which is the external trigeminal nerve stimulator. So both were originally approved for treatment of just migraine headache.
Okay.
Right. And so, again, that is one of those weird curiosity things. So, they gave us the demo devices. I had them in clinic. So a few patients with vestibular migraine attacks, they happen while they're in the waiting room or happen early in the morning, and then they happen to come to clinic. And they're like, hey, want to zap? Like, okay. And so, you zap them. So for, try whichever one was available. So try, the gamma core one, which goes on the neck, and then the trigeminal nerve one in different patients, of course, right? And so the interesting thing was, I found that it did help with the vertigo too. Now, how it helped with the vertigo, that one we are not so clear, right? So for the vagus nerve stimulator, the vagus nerve definitely in the brainstem, there's so many different connections it has with the trigeminal system, with the vestibular system. So, could that help with vestibular migraine by acting on the, vestibular system or the trigeminal system or both? Hard to say. Most likely both, if I had to bet on it. The trigeminal nerve stimulator, that one's a little more interesting. It's a TENS unit, stimulates the V1 branch of the trigeminal nerve. Now, how that acts on the vestibular system is a little less clear. But, Dr. Deloso did fantastic work in the congenital nystagmus patients. So he showed that, stimulating the trigeminal branch can actually alter the patterns of nystagmus. So, we think that's most likely the case. And pathway probably the pathway is, from the nerves that carry proprioceptive signals from the extraocular muscles to the vestibular system. So by stimulating the V1, it seems to help with us also with triple PD, surprisingly enough, right, in my patient population. So I have patients who have, they get triple PD, get really, uncomfortable with certain visual stimuli and everything. And so, they found that, it does help their condition too. So it's not just from migraine, there can be some action on the vestibular system too.
Okay. And so, now in talking about, this movement from vascular to trigeminal, and, traditionally it's like, okay, what are your migraine food triggers, which can be very complicated to track and log food. But now there's a little bit more movement of, instead of direct correlation, it's like gut to brain. And so talking about nutrition is important. And certainly you're a supporter. I'm a follower of the Dizzy Cook, Alicia Wolf, who's just been amazing. We share your book and her book equally, but there does seem to be this kind of gut to brain connection associated with migraines. What are your thoughts around that?
It's very complex. To put it simply, right? So, if you talk about the gut-brain connection, of course, there is the whole IBS connection with migraine. So people who have IBS tend to also have migraine. And the interesting thing is IBS and migraine are both conditions related to low serotonin levels and also low vitamin D levels, which is, fascinating. Why, some people with migraine have IBS, whereas others don't, that is not so clear. But we definitely see a higher incidence of IBS in people who have migraine. Now, when it comes to nutrition, that also becomes very interesting, So if we talk about, could it be like food allergies, could it be other things in the food? And I think the answer is, it's not as simple as that. The allergy point of view certainly gets some traction. A lot of people, I think there were a couple of studies that showed that people who produce certain antibodies against certain foods also tend to have, migraine attacks related to those foods. And so, anything that causes, inflammation can trigger your migraine. So, seasonal allergies is one of them, right? So when you have more allergies with, pollen flying around, then you can really have more migraine attacks. In the same way, if you have some food allergy and you eat that food, definitely you can have more migraine. So that leads us to the whole gluten, dairy thing. I have a lot of questions about, should I avoid gluten? Should I avoid dairy? And so the question then would be, those are not your typical migraine triggers in that sense. But, if you do have an intolerance to gluten, to dairy, then, eating those things can definitely aggravate your migraine. The MSG content of the food, like, MSG, you have the tyramine content of food. So those also can trigger migraines independently. MSG, we think of it more from the glutamate standpoint. It's an excitatory neurotransmitter. So, eating too much of that can potentially cause migraine. And then, tyramine can also do it, so anything that's, highly fermented definitely, has a higher content of tyramine, which also can cause, more migraine attacks. Caffeine, that's an interesting one. So that one plays a very, interesting role. It's in small amounts, caffeine can help with migraine. Right. But in larger amounts, we think what happens is, your body reacts to it by, producing more, adenosine and adenosine receptors. And that probably is the source of, migraine aggravation there. And of course, too much caffeine can cause, migraine, medication overuse headaches.
Right. Well, it is very, very complex. Because we do a lot of patient education on both sides, on the physician side, on the therapy side, on the clinician side. And I was curious, and this was part of a question too, is do you have any advice for therapists of like when you're just sitting around like, oh, I've seen these patients, I wish that blank in vestibular therapy, that we could help you help who we're referring a patient to. Do you have any advice for on the therapy side?
I mean, so far working with all the good vestibular therapists, all of you are great. So, I don't have nothing really to add from there. It's I think with like more unexperienced therapists. So like, physical therapists who don't have much experience with vestibular therapy, what I notice with a lot of patients is, they just give them the standard, quote unquote, stuff to do. All right, here's a piece of paper, go read up on what to do, look at your finger, flick your head back and forth, follow your finger up and down a few times, and then the patient says, oh, I didn't get better with vestibular therapy. Mm-hmm. And so, for those, who don't have much experience with vestibular therapy, then, the whole key on customizing things, making sure, you personalize, each patient's treatment plan. I think that is the most important thing there. I think another big need, I would say, is neck issues, shoulder issues. Mm-hmm. So that's, I think, seeing a lot of patients who, have neck problems, dizzy patients, because all of them, because eventually, they try and stiffen up to try and, not move around so much. If we can get somebody who the proper treatment plan for those, or proper therapists who know how to really deal with the neck stuff, I think that also is really helpful.
Yeah, it's so important to bridge this gap between ortho and more what we would call on the neuro side.
Exactly.
And just, I have been afraid of the neck for so long. I mean, it's like I'm a vestibular therapist, but as we began to develop our coursework and work with like Dr. Rich, orthopedic cervicogenic dizziness specialist, she's like, you got to get your hands on people. And now just adding maybe 3 simple tests to an assessment has really helped either add things or say, what, I think getting the neck addressed first is better. So to me, it's impossible to separate the ears, the eyes, and the neck.
Absolutely.
When it comes to dizziness. And
like I saw a patient earlier today, she actually found that she got better with vestibular therapy, but vestibular therapy caused her neck to get worse. And so, she's like, vestibular therapy helps me, but then, it makes my neck hurt. So what should I do? I'm like, it's kind of hard.
Yeah. Yep. Well, and I think that happens, in vestibular therapy, we're trying to improve eye-head coordination through adapting the VOR. And so now people are moving their head around more, but then they might get a little dizzy. So then their body's like, I don't want to be dizzy. So they stiffen, and I really think it's our responsibility when we give an exercise. Are we compromising posture? Are we compromising range of motion? Are we compromising quality of movement? And if we are, this activity that patient may not be ready. Do you have any advice? Like, let's say on the therapy side, we're seeing a patient and they're going in and out of migraines. They don't seem to be stable. Is it just best to say, let's put this on hold and find a physician? How important is stabilizing a patient with migraines to have optimal outcomes in therapy?
I won't say so much of stabilizing, but I like to call it like, kind of cooling it down a little bit. So,
Okay.
you're absolutely right. It's people who are in the midst of, let's say, really bad, like a lot of vestibular migraine issues, they can't tolerate the slightest movement. And I think sending them for therapy is just asking for trouble in those situations because, most of it will just get worse. So those are the patients I think would, really benefit from, medication management first, trying to, get something on board, cool things down. And then, once they can at least tolerate more movement, then that's when, I think vestibular therapy can be a very helpful measure. While everything is, on fire, in the beginning, things sending for vestibular therapy will just aggravate them.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We've been talking with our patients quite a bit. It's mentioned in your book about this kind of elevated sympathetic nervous system response, kind of fight or flight, and some neuro research coming out with 3PD and the anterior cingulate, cortex, which is going to help regulate, mood and emotion and actually sequencing of movement. So, do you think that kind of not just meditation and grounding, but kind of mind body work, do you see that as a critical piece to managing patients with vestibular migraine?
Absolutely. Everything, like when it comes to like the mindfulness, that whole, retraining type of thing, I think that's hugely important, especially in people who have had symptoms for a long time and, triple PD, for example, huge need for that. Yep.
Triple PD, 3PD, is that pretty prevalent in your patient population? Yeah.
Absolutely. So anything that makes people dizzy, anything that gives them vertigo can put them into triple PD. And so, vestibular migraine with repeated attacks of vertigo and dizziness, huge link to triple PD. Most of them, actually, I think more than half of my patients with vestibular migraine have triple PD.
Yeah. And do you have to then weigh like migraine management medication as well as like SSRIs? Are you bringing in both of those approaches? Obviously, you have to customize it to the patient.
In the majority, controlling the migraine, I think, is key to getting the triple PD better. I always tell my patients, because then they ask me like exactly that, do you treat the triple PD? Do you treat the vestibular migraine? I think the truth, because vestibular migraine is the root of evil. So, you treat the vestibular migraine and the triple PD should get better. There are some in whom, the vestibular migraine comes under really good control, but the triple PD remains. That's the ones, I think, we can try maybe add like an SSRI, SNRI, or, most of the time, vestibular therapy.
Yeah.
Go see Bridget.
Yeah. And so many other great vestibular therapists out there. Okay, so let's see. I've asked the majority of these questions. I see some questions going. I've seen you post questions to migraine sufferers, like what works best for you. So do you think social media has it helped you? Can it make us be better practitioners?
I think yes. So, I learned a lot from Twitter.
I
Like,
do
you
too.
do pick up like, you see people posting about certain things or their latest research, and that, how many of us like, really go to PubMed, week at least every day and then look at the latest articles that pop up on Vertigo, right? Whereas like if it's quick, the centers that produce the research, they can quickly post like a little update and you're like, oh my goodness, look at that. And then you pick it up. And then there are some, users that, they follow a lot of these research and then the other one, they diligently repost stuff and they're like, hey, great.
I know, it's
You
just
become aware of
amazing.
stuff. Yep, you learn it. And, like lately, a lot of people are posting like, the long COVID stuff, right? So, you're learning like how it relates to dizziness, what does it cause? We're still learning so much about it. There's who I've seen, I think, not a lot, but a handful of patients so far who's triple PD, vestibular migraine, and MDD started after they got COVID.
I mean, we've definitely seen that in our practice. More complicated BPPV, much higher 3PD, definitely. So we will provide our listeners with your as well as additional information because it is quite amazing to follow you. Okay, so I'm gonna go to some questions here, and wow, there's been a lot. Okay, so and we'll get through as many as we can here in the next few minutes. So after a vestibular event, Someone had been left with pressure in a trochlear nerve, which seems to have been in the form of attacks. My diagnosis is vestibular migraine by Dr. Ballo at UCLA. I've had no migraine characteristics, sensitivity to light or sound, some convergence insufficiency. Well, thank you for the kind words they said about the clinic. So really, I think this is so the question is wondering if there could be primarily a trochlear headache, I guess, versus migraine, vestibular migraine.
Absolutely. So, I mean, the vestibular event, may just have been a coincidence. If you're not having like continuous issues with dizziness, vertigo, with the pain, I can't make the diagnosis of vestibular migraine, right? You definitely have something called trochleodynia. So, it's where the trochlear tendon and then, is. So what you get, Dr. That Friedman, excellent. I won't do it because, I don't feel comfortable poking a needle into your eye socket, right? But Dr. Deb Friedman, I know she does it. I think some of the headache specialists can do it too. They can do like a little trochlear block. So they put like a, lidocaine injection right inside there.
And so that actually, what you just said is related to a previous question that I realized I missed is, based on the diagnostic criteria of vestibular migraines, the 5 characteristics, one of those is that you have a history of migraines. Are you pretty much a stickler?
Current or previous history of migraine?
Current or previous. So if someone came in with zero current. So if someone didn't have a history, but currently we're coming in with symptoms, you would still feel this is vestibular migraine related.
So I'm not a stickler when it comes to the diagnostic criteria, right? When it comes to treatment, as long as, if we have a fair degree of confidence that we're dealing with migraine related, dizziness, migraine-related vertigo, then we can treat it as migraine. We don't need the diagnostic criteria for that. But let's just say, I think where the diagnostic criteria comes in handy is more for on the research side, right? So, if you want to conduct a research study into people with vestibular migraine, then I think the diagnostic criteria is very helpful there because it gives you a set, so all right, everyone has to, follow these rules before they allow you to study because, you don't want to, pull in a whole different bunch of people with different conditions and then, it becomes all jumbled.
And it's interesting when you talk about different conditions. We know we do a lot trying to figure out what is this diagnosis, not what's the functional, what may be the underlying medical diagnosis contributing to this. But in doing so, especially I think sometimes with 3PD, do you find that there's also a time to leave your diagnosis at the door? And meaning like, now that we have this, let's not let that diagnosis define you and focus on recovery. Do you find people get trapped in their diagnosis?
That can be an issue, yes. There are those that, just focus on their diagnoses and, don't want to, or they get too stressed out by it in the sense. So, they get just so consumed by the diagnosis that it becomes, like a death sentence in a way. They think that, oh, this is the end, this is what I have, it's horrible, woe is me type of deal. The ones that I find very, encouraging would be like, Alicia Wolf, right? She's like, okay, I got vestibular migraine, but I'm going to work around it, and, in a way it kind of has defined her, but in a very positive way.
Sure.
Right. So she has the condition, but she doesn't let it control her, but she turns it around and she uses it to, help many people who have vestibular migraine. Right. So, I think that's 2 ways of dealing with, condition, the chronic condition, right? Number 1, you let it just, eat you up. And then number 2 is, you grab it and then you start, fighting it and then using it to, help and educate others with the same condition.
Well, and what I find with patients, especially like when they've seen someone like you, is it's our nature. We want to know as humans, like what is causing this. And so I think for the most part, when people get that diagnosis, they go see you and it's a medical provider, it's a physician saying, this is what it is. I think that actually gives them a space for a greater recovery because they just want to be understood.
Absolutely. Yep. Not knowing, illness, uncertainty, not knowing what you're dealing with, it's horrible. It's, most of the patients I see too, once they have like the diagnosis there, once they know what they're dealing with and there's a name to it, it's just not this amorphous collection of symptoms that everyone is like, who knows what is
Yeah.
it? Vertigo,
Yeah.
dizziness. All right. And so knowing what they're dealing with, I think it's extremely helpful. Yeah.
And okay, so another question here. And do you know of any link between Hashimoto's disease and recurring BPPV?
I'm not aware of that, but that's interesting. Yeah, not aware of any particular link between the two. I know like the biggest risk factors, for recurrent BPPV, you got migraine, diabetes, high blood pressure, head trauma, things like that. But Hashimoto's, that's interesting.
Yeah, sir. I mean, I think we always look for that pattern of autoimmune and high recurrences of dizziness. So I think those do go together. And this question, I think Dr. Beh may have been asked because you already answered it. Are you seeing post-COVID migraines, 3PD, and let's see, I think it just, and what's your treatment approach? So you've actually kind of answered it. If there's anything else you want to add to that.
So yeah, absolutely. I think the treatment approach is pretty much the same as with triple PD, with migraine. The only thing I would say that makes it sometimes a bit complicated is when if they tell you that the fatigue part of things, right? So the fatigue, if you don't have like say COVID, migraine, triple PD, all of that also can be associated with some degree of fatigue. But with COVID on board, then you definitely also have to worry about any cardiac complications, pulmonary complications. So I think that just adds a whole layer of complexity to it.
Yeah, I think it's definitely we're going to be learning more and more and more. And then do you see like an increase, Kelly is kind of asking this, when there's an inflammatory response in the body and whether it's high recurrences of BPPV, migraine, do you see that correlation?
I think it's entirely possible for sure, and you get more inflammation, like with the whole migraine thing, right? With more migraine attacks, could there be more inflammation in your inner ear that's driving, the recurrence or refractory BPPV? Other inflammatory conditions definitely could potentially do that. I'm not aware, off the top of my head, I'm not aware of any like specific studies that would, show like say, with MS or rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, that shows that, you do get recurrent BPPV.
And I think we all know that, you're not only a key thought leader, but you're a key thought leader in a small pond. There's not a lot of views out there. But you are able to do assessments via telehealth, correct? Like if we had listeners in other states, other areas, their patients couldn't get to you, is it possible that they could share your information? We could share your information with them and their patients could potentially set up a telehealth visit?
Yeah, absolutely. So, open to telemedicine visits, I like in person, but then, I realized like with COVID, with, other people from other states, I'm always open to telemedicine appointments.
Yeah. And you actually, again, going back to the Vestibular Today interview, you talked about the impact COVID has really brought telemedicine to the forefront. And what you were saying in that interview is it's pretty easy to assess. Most people have had their tests. The subject of intake is so important, which you can do online. You can prescribe most medications fairly easy, but really where it gets difficult is recommending more tests or therapy across state lines.
Right. So if you're going to order, like certain tests, MRIs, for example, you can't, you still need like their local physicians to help with that. Yeah. I think, with working with experienced therapists too is hugely important. I cannot, tell you how much easier you make my life sometimes. a good vestibular therapist on board to help, because sometimes, medications are not the only thing, or if they have intolerance to 20 different medications that I've tried, then, having an experienced vestibular therapist to help, I tell you, amazing. Right. Oh, the cold water question. I see the cold water question. I think that's very interesting. So that goes to your vagus nerve.
Okay, so here it is.
That one has this issue with that one also has some scientific basis. That one more, vagus nerve stimulation.
Yeah, because it is cold water. I feel better if I swim in the cold Pacific or take a cold shower.
Vagus nerve.
Yeah, and some people have a lot of symptoms when they take a hot shower. Yeah, they
Heat
just, they're like,
intolerance is actually a big problem with people who have migraine.
yeah, it's
Multiple
huge, huge.
neurological things. MS is the famous one. Heat
Yeah.
worsens
Hmm.
MS.
Okay, well, we have wrapped up this hour. It has, as always, been a pleasure. Thank you, Dr. Beh. Thank you to our listeners. This is recorded, and so you'll have future access to it. We'll provide you the links to Dr. Beh, to the Dizzy Cook, and also his book. So thank you so much,
Thank you for
and
having me. Always a pleasure.
can't wait to see you again
Yep, soon.
soon.
Yes.
All right.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.